Dr. Carlos Mendez always believed that justice was more than a profession. It was a mission. As a judge, he was not only an arbiter of the law, but a beacon of hope for many in his community. His dark skin and impeccable suit symbolized a resilient strength in a society marked by prejudice and inequality. Carlos, after years of dedication to his studies and career, had earned a place of respect in an often hostile system. The courtroom was packed on that sunny day. It was preparing to hear a racial discrimination case where a young black man had been wrongly accused of a crime he did not commit. Carlos stepped up to the bench and looked around the room, where familiar faces stared at him expectantly. He took a deep breath, feeling the responsibility he had on his hands. This was a defining moment not only for the young man accused, but also for the community that supported him. Justice should not be a privilege, but a right for all, he began, his voice echoing around the room. The words resonated among those present, and a murmur of approval spread. Carlos could feel the energy in the air. Every person there was eager for change, for confirmation that the system could, in fact, be fair. After delivering his verdict, he left the courtroom feeling empowered. For him, each day was a new opportunity to make a difference, even in a society that often tried to silence voices like his. With this sense of purpose, Carlos headed to the parking lot, prepared for another day of work in the fight for equality. What he didn't know was that his life was about to change forever. After the trial, Dr. Carlos Mendez left the courtroom with a smile on his face, deep in thought about the positive impact of his decision. He used to say that each verdict was a brick in the construction of a more just world, and that day, he felt he had added a solid stone to the foundation of equality. The city, although full of challenges, pulsed with hope that better days were ahead. As he walked to his car, a sedan he had inherited from his father, Carlos remembered his family's history. His father, an immigrant who struggled to raise his children in a country that often denied them opportunities, always encouraged him to fight for the rights of the less fortunate. The car represented not only a connection to his roots, but also a constant reminder of his father's legacy. Each time he got into the vehicle, he felt energized to face the challenges that life threw at him. As he started the engine and hit the road, Carlos allowed himself to reflect on his work and what still needed to be done. He had plans to implement a legal education program for young people in the community, helping to empower them and teach them about their rights. The idea of seeing more young people fighting against injustice motivated him. The traffic was light, and he took the opportunity to relax. The soft music playing on the radio seemed to harmonize with his optimistic vision for the future. The city, although full of problems, had a unique beauty. He admired the old buildings, the flowering trees, and the busy streets, where people from different backgrounds shared the same space, even if not always in harmony. But as he drove, a sudden jolt interrupted his thoughts. Blue and red lights flashed behind him. Carlos felt a knot form in his stomach. He had heard stories of unfair police stops, but he never thought this could happen to him. The judge, who had always upheld the law, now found himself at the mercy of a system that often failed to protect those who needed it most. He parked and waited, a mixture of anxiety and indignation rising inside him. As he stepped out of the car, the reality of his situation became even more alarming. The approaching police officer was not just an officer of the law, but a symbol of a system he had fought against. What was supposed to be a normal day was about to turn into a test of his faith in justice. Officer Thompson approached with a stern expression, his gaze fixed on Carlos. "You're driving a stolen car," he said, without introducing himself or offering any explanation. The authoritative tone of voice and lack of courtesy left Carlos puzzled and indignant. He knew he had the legal right to be there, but that seemed irrelevant given the situation. "Excuse me, officer? This is my car," Carlos replied, trying to remain calm. "I'm a judge, and I can prove that I'm the owner. Here are the documents." He started to search for the documents in the glove compartment, but the tension in the atmosphere seemed to cut through the air. The police officer interrupted him, gesturing sharply. "I don't want to hear your excuses. Get out of the car," Thompson ordered, his voice booming like thunder. The judge hesitated for a moment, trying to process the gravity of the situation. It was surreal. He had spent his life defending justice, and now he found himself in the position of a man under suspicion, even though he had no reason to be. Carlos got out of the car slowly, keeping his arms visible. "I really don't understand what's going on. I am in compliance with the law. My name is Dr. Carlos Mendez, and I have all the necessary documents to prove that this car is mine." But the officer was not interested in Carlos's words. Thompson frisked him without any consideration, while the judge felt the humiliation growing inside him. The officer's touch on his body, the way he looked at him as if he were a criminal, all of this left him in a state of deep indignation. He was not just a judge in that moment. He was a black man facing the brutality of a system that often did not see him as human. "You should care more about your appearance, doctor," the police officer commented with a sarcastic smile, looking him up and down. "Maybe you should drive a car that doesn't draw attention to yourself." Carlos swallowed hard, anger boiling in his chest. It was an insult not only to his position, but also to his identity. He took a deep breath, trying to find a balance. "Officer, I beg you to check the records. You will find that this car is mine. I am willing to cooperate fully." The officer hesitated for a moment, perhaps considering the possibility that he was actually telling the truth. But Thompson's belief in racial assumptions was stronger than reason. "You may be a judge, but that doesn't mean you're above the law," Thompson snapped, looking at Carlos with disdain. "I'll call for backup." Carlos felt his world crumble around him. This wasn't just a matter of honor. It was a representation of everything he had fought against. He was about to be treated like a criminal, even though he had dedicated his life to justice. In that moment, he realized that the fight against discrimination was not just a professional one, but also deeply personal. As the officer walked away to make the call, Carlos felt the need to do something. He knew he had to fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced similar injustices. Helplessness quickly turned to determination. He would refuse to be silenced or humiliated. If need be, he would see this fight through to the end. As he waited for reinforcements to arrive, Carlos felt the curious stares of passing motorists. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. He was a judge, a defender of justice, and now he was at the mercy of the brutality of a police officer who did not hesitate to exercise his power. The voices of support from his community echoed in his mind, but at that moment, it all seemed distant and unreal. Reinforcements arrived quickly, a group of police officers who looked at him as if he were a dangerous criminal. The situation was getting worse. One of them, a burly man with a cold expression, approached. "What do we have here?" he asked, completely disregarding Carlos' dignity. "A judge accused of driving a stolen car," Thompson replied, with a smile that seemed to revel in the humiliation. The new officer looked at Carlos with disdain, as if he were less than human. "Sir, you're being held on suspicion of robbery," the new officer announced, and Carlos felt a wave of despair. "We're taking you to the police station for questioning." The humiliation deepened with each word. Carlos felt his world crumble. He was not just a judge, but a man being treated like a criminal. As the officers handcuffed him, his mind boiled with indignation. He would not give in to despair. Instead, he was determined to stand tall, even in the face of humiliation. "You have no right to treat me like this," he declared, his voice firm despite the vulnerability he felt. "I am the judge of this city. I am part of the system you are supposed to protect." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers led him to the patrol car, and the world around him seemed to spin. The weight of the handcuffs on his wrists was a constant reminder of the injustice he was facing. He wanted to scream. He wanted everyone to know what was happening. How could the law, which he so defended, turn against him in such a cruel way? Inside the police car, Carlos tried to calm his mind. He knew he couldn't let this situation define him. His fight was just beginning, and he had to remember that the truth was on his side. The judge who had always sought justice now had to be the very embodiment of it, even when the system seemed to be against him. As the police car drove away, Carlos felt determination grow within him. He would not let this humiliation end his life or his career. With every mile he drove, the spark of struggle burned brighter within him. He promised himself that he would fight not only for his innocence, but for all those who had been silenced and marginalized. The police car pulled up in front of the station, and the sound of the doors opening sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Carlos. The officers led him out of the car, and he could feel the eyes of the other officers in the station on him. It was a cold room, with gray walls and a smell of disinfectant that couldn't seem to wash away the stench of injustice. Carlos felt like he was on trial before any evidence had even been presented. He was led into an interrogation room, where he was forced to sit at a cold metal table. Officer Thompson entered, followed by another officer. The atmosphere was oppressive, and tension hung in the air. Thompson looked pleased with himself, as if he were about to enjoy the spectacle that was about to come. "Now, let's see if your story fits," Thompson said, opening a notebook and beginning to jot down notes. "Tell us, how do you explain driving a car that, according to our records, was reported stolen?" Carlos took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "I've explained. This car is mine. I have all the documents to prove that I'm the owner. I'm willing to cooperate with any investigation." Frustration boiled over, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You know how the law works, Doctor. A judge must understand that appearance is everything. To us, you look like just another criminal," Thompson said, the mockery in his voice evident. "This may not end well for you." Carlos felt his heart race. He knew that justice was supposed to be blind, but he couldn't ignore the weight of Thompson's words. It was a battle between his position and the distorted perception that many had of him. The fight against discrimination was there, in its rawest form. "If you're trying to intimidate him, it's not working," Carlos replied defiantly. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a judge, and I'm going to fight for that." He looked Thompson straight in the eye, a firm determination in his gaze. The conversation was interrupted when another officer entered the room, carrying a folder of documents. "Mr. Thompson, we have the vehicle registration information," the officer said, and the tension in the air seemed palpable. Carlos held his breath, hoping the truth would be on his side. If the documents confirmed his ownership, it could change everything. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for his dignity, for his identity. He wouldn't let himself be defeated. Thompson looked over the documents, and for a moment, the silence in the room was deafening. Carlos knew the truth was on his side, and with each passing second, his determination grew. What had been a moment of humiliation and uncertainty could soon turn into a victory. The silence in the interrogation room seemed endless as Thompson examined the documents. Carlos watched the officer's expression, a mix of disbelief and frustration. He sensed that the truth was only moments away from being revealed, but uncertainty still hung in the air like a dark cloud. The weight of the situation was almost unbearable, but he refused to let it get him down. Finally, Thompson looked up from his documents and glared at Carlos with a look of anger and disdain. "It looks like you do own this car," he said reluctantly. "But that doesn't change the fact that the situation isn't ideal." Carlos felt a wave of relief, but also a rising indignation. "It doesn't change the fact that I was treated like a criminal for no reason. What kind of justice is that?" The frustration in his voice echoed through the room, and he realized he was feeling stronger. "You may be the owner, but that doesn't mean your word is good enough. We need to investigate further," Thompson retorted, with an air of disdain that was familiar to Carlos. "The problems you're facing may very well be more than just this small issue." Those words sent a chill down Carlos's spine. He knew that for many, his position as a judge meant nothing when it came to racial perception. The fight for justice was not just a legal battle. It was a fight to be recognized as a dignified human being, not a statistic or a stereotype. As Thompson continued to speak, Carlos felt he needed a strategy. He couldn't just wait for things to resolve themselves. His voice needed to be heard, and he needed to connect with those who could change the situation. "If you can't see what's going on here, then am I the problem?" he asked, his indignation turning into a cry for empathy. At that moment, a second officer entered the room with a worried expression. "Mr. Thompson, we need you at headquarters. The situation is escalating out there." Carlos saw the opportunity. "Please take me with you. Let me speak. If not for myself, then for the community that faces this injustice every day." Thompson hesitated, but the urgency of the situation forced him to agree. "Okay, but that doesn't mean you're off the hook. "We'll settle this at headquarters." Carlos felt a glimmer of hope, knowing this was a crucial moment. He needed to act, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced. As they were led into the station, Carlos could feel the tension rising in the air. Officers moved quickly, responding to calls and preparing to deal with a crowd that had gathered outside. He could sense that the situation was escalating, and the determination within him grew. This was the moment to amplify his voice, to become an advocate not only for his own dignity, but for all those who faced similar injustices. When they reached the command room, Carlos saw the police chief arguing with officers. The room was hectic, and frustration was evident on the officers' faces. The chief looked at Carlos with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "What are you doing here? This is not your place," he said, his voice thick with authority. "I am a judge, and I am here to speak about the injustice I have just faced," Carlos replied firmly. "I know you are dealing with a tense situation out there, but the way the law is applied to me is a microcosm of what many people are experiencing. I am not just a judge. I am a human being who has been treated with disrespect." The officers in the room exchanged glances, and Carlos could tell his message was starting to resonate. He continued, "The injustice I face today is a reflection of what many citizens face every day. We need to change that. We need to listen to the voices of our community, not ignore them." One of the officers, a younger man with a worried expression, raised his hand. "I understand what you're saying. Too often, the police are seen as oppressive, and that's not what we want. We're here to protect the community, not divide it." Carlos felt he was starting to make a connection. We need more dialogue between the police and the community. People need to feel safe, not just from law enforcement, but also from how the law is applied to them. That starts with empathy. The police chief hesitated, but finally leaned forward. "What do you suggest? We have to resolve this situation quickly, and you can help us understand what's going on out there." Carlos took a deep breath. He knew he had a chance to make a difference. "We must meet with community leaders and engage with protesters. We cannot ignore the anger and pain they are feeling. If we want to build a just society, we need to start listening." The tension in the room began to dissipate, and a new determination appeared on the officers' faces. Carlos realized that perhaps his struggle was not in vain. He was ready to stand up and fight not only for himself, but for all those who called for change. The police chief nodded, agreeing with Carlos's proposal. "Very well. Let's organize a meeting with the community leaders and try to resolve this peacefully. If the situation escalates outside, things could get out of hand." Carlos felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He knew it was a monumental task, but the urgency of the moment gave him courage. "We can start right now," he suggested, his heart pounding. "We can't wait for tensions to escalate any further." With that, the police chief got on the radio and made calls to gather community leaders. As they waited, Carlos sat in a chair, trying to gather his thoughts. He remembered so many conversations with friends and colleagues about the role of the police and the injustices that many faced on a daily basis. It was a complex dilemma, but he knew that change could only happen if everyone was willing to listen and learn. Minutes later, a group of community leaders entered the room. Among them, Carlos recognized Maria, a respected activist in the community. She had long fought for civil rights and had a history of difficult conversations with law enforcement. "Dr. Carlos," she greeted, her eyes shining with hope. "What's going on here?" Carlos stood up and, with an inviting gesture, made her sit down. "We are here to try to find a solution to what is happening out there. The injustice I have faced is just the tip of the iceberg. We need to find a way to build a dialogue between the police and the community." Maria looked at the police chief, who was standing next to Carlos. "And what are you willing to do to make sure this doesn't happen again, so we can feel safe and heard?" The police chief frowned, but before he could respond, Carlos intervened. "We need a commitment, a promise that the police will be willing to listen to the community's concerns and be accountable for their actions. It's not enough to just say everything is fine. We need concrete action." Maria nodded, her expression reflecting a mixture of hope and skepticism. "We need a change of mindset. We can no longer live in a world where distrust reigns. We must learn to work together." Maria's words echoed in the room, and Carlos felt a surge of determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but the dialogue he was beginning was a step in the right direction. He was there, not just as a judge, but as a voice for justice, for those who could not defend themselves. Discussions began to flow, and ideas began to intertwine, forming a mosaic of hopes and challenges. Carlos realized that the transformation would not be instantaneous, but with each word exchanged, they were laying the foundations for a new beginning. The command room was electrically charged as community leaders and police officers began to find common ground. Carlos felt uplifted, watching the dialogue unfold. The tensions that had previously permeated the room were slowly being replaced by a sense of hope. Human connection was blossoming, and amidst the chaos, a moment of unity seemed possible. After lengthy discussions, the police chief agreed to hold a community meeting in the town square. "We need to bring everyone to the table. Let's invite the community to come and talk and listen to their concerns. I believe we can come up with a plan of action together," he said, his voice firm. Maria looked at Carlos, her eyes shining with determination. "This is a start, but we need to make sure this isn't just a symbolic event. We need an ongoing commitment to change, not just empty words." Carlos agreed. "We need a feedback system. We need to have the voices of the community heard and respected after the meeting. People need to know that their feelings and experiences are valid and that their concerns will be taken seriously." The police chief nodded, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Understood. I'll assign a team to work alongside you and ensure we can follow up on the concerns raised. Let's get this done." The plan was taking shape. The meeting was scheduled for the next day, and the city streets began to murmur about the meeting. Carlos knew it was a risk, but the potential to unite the community and the police was palpable. People were tired of being ignored and misunderstood. They needed a platform to express their pain and their hopes. As they prepared to leave the room, Carlos gathered his courage and said, "This is the moment. We need to not just talk, but act. Change starts here, with each of us deciding to step forward." Maria smiled and added, "It's time to write a new story. May we remember this day as the beginning of something transformative." As everyone stood, a sense of hope and determination filled the room. Carlos felt that, although the road was still long, they were beginning to walk a path of justice, empathy, and understanding. It was a moment that promised to bring new light to the darkness that had prevailed for too long. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the central square. Carlos was nervous as he watched people begin to gather. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and mixed emotions. He knew the meeting could be a game changer, but he was also aware that many were still skeptical of the promises made. Maria and other community leaders arrived early to prepare the space. Carlos walked to the makeshift stage, where a microphone was ready to be used. He took a deep breath, feeling the pressure in his chest. What he said now could impact not only his life, but the lives of many. As the space filled with citizens, including several people who had demonstrated during the previous disturbance, the tension in the air was palpable. The police chief arrived with a delegation of officers, and Carlos saw curious looks and, in some cases, distrust. "Good morning, everyone. We appreciate each and every one of you being here," Carlos began, trying to convey a calm that he did not fully feel. "Today, we are here to listen and, more importantly, to engage in dialogue. Each of you has a story, an experience that deserves to be heard. And as a judge, I am here to ensure that those voices are respected." A murmur ran through the crowd. He noticed some people nodding, while others had doubtful expressions. But as he looked at Maria, who was standing next to him, he felt a wave of support. The police chief stepped forward. "As the leader of our team, I am here to listen to your concerns. We know that what has happened in the last few days does not reflect who we should be as a police force. It is time to rethink our approach, to become more approachable and understanding." A woman in the crowd raised her hand, and Carlos invited her to speak. "You talk about change, but we've faced empty promises before. How can we trust that this will be any different?" Carlos sensed the urgency in her voice and replied, "Trust is built through transparency and mutual respect. We are here not just to make promises, but to create real commitment. We need a system that allows each of you to share your experiences and for the consequences to be taken seriously, Maria added, "We want actions, not just words. It's time to change the narrative and create a community where everyone feels safe and respected. This is our chance to work together." The crowd began to stir, and Carlos felt that, despite the doubts, there was a spark of hope. If they could channel this energy, they could indeed create a more just and collaborative future.